Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The narrow lanes behind Covent Garden woke before dawn. Lights seeped through shutters like thin milk through muslin. Carts rattled over cobblestones, their wheels crusted with frost and market scent. Somewhere a bell rang for matin prayers, but most did not stop for the sound. The city's poor had their own liturgy, the hiss of boiling dye, the rasp of broom straw, the cough of chimney boys. Our Milliner's life began among those noises long before anyone thought of calling her a craftswoman. Her mother was a laundress who worked for kitchens and respectable boarding houses. Steam was always rising from their one-room dwelling. When the child pressed her palm to the little window, she could trace a cross or a spiral in the fog. She liked the feeling of shaping something on glass, even if it vanished a heartbeat later. There is a certain wisdom in those early gestures. The world allows small creations only for them to fade, and yet the hand repeats them again with patience. The first hat she touched was not truly hers. It belonged to the mistress of an older milliner named Mrs. Pratt, who lived upstairs. The child carried bundles for her mother, and one morning Mrs. Pratt asked her to hold a round block of straw while she tied a ribbon. The straw smelled of summer fields, though the day itself was gray. "Mind the brim," the old woman murmured. That was all, yet something in that caution stayed with the girl. To mind the brim meant to mind the edge between beauty and waste, between skill and error, between one class and another. Soon she was helping every week, sweeping the wooden floor of trimmings and thread. She learned to listen more than to speak. The customers came with rustling skirts and voices smooth as eggshells. They liked to see themselves in mirrors, but seldom looked at the women behind them. The girl learned to cut ribbons straight, to roll feathers carefully, and to press her lips together when pupils from the charity school giggled outside. Silence could hold one's dignity where words might betray it. Her mother noticed how her fingers shaped even the smallest scraps into flowers. Once, a landlord's wife passed by the open door of Mrs. Pratt's workroom and paused to admire a miniature rose made from leftover taffeta. For a moment, the child's world grew larger. Compliments could feel like coins, bright but rare. That night she could not sleep. The candle burned low as she thought how beauty, once noticed, might become a form of currency. Seasons turned. London's breath thickened with coal dust, yet spring brought brief renewal. Laundering on lines, primrose cellars by the bridge, children chasing each other over puddles. The apprentice was now strong enough to carry baskets of straw to the dyer's shop. Each errand opened a new sense of place: fish markets yawning to the river, a bookseller's stall with sheets of copperplate angels. Poor neighborhoods had their own perfumes: starch, soot, orange peel from discarded lunches. These became, unknowingly, the scents of her youth. The old milliner taught her the value of proportion. "Every head tells its secret," Mrs. Pratt said one evening, pinning lace onto the wooden form. "A foolish woman wears height. A clever woman wears shadow." The girl pondered this, not fully understanding, yet something took root. In time she would measure confidence by how low or high her hat sat. In those days, lessons were wrapped in simple tasks, as knowledge often is for the poor. Money, of course, trickled slowly. She brought half her earnings to her mother, who was aging under the weight of irons and soap. Sometimes the child thought of escaping, marrying a tradesman or sailing somewhere, but she respected the quiet pride of making ends meet. Hope lived not in sudden grand changes, but in the sturdy rhythm of days that repeated themselves. When one lives close to hunger, moderation becomes a form of grace. Sundays offered a sliver of leisure. She would walk to the park at the edge of the city, where trees still dared to stand. There, she watched families with parasols, gentlemen in tailored coats, creatures of another world. Yet she did not envy them. Her delight came from observing how people revealed themselves in their posture, in the way they adjusted hats or fidgeted with gloves. The city was a theater, and every passer-by unknowingly played a part. She sat quietly, seeing more than she was seen. When Mrs. Pratt fell ill, the workshop changed. The younger women whispered about closing it, fearing rent arrears. But the apprentice, now nearly grown, offered to take on extra orders. She often worked till midnight, the candle shaking with each breath of passing wind. In that dim circle of light, she discovered the steadiness of her own will. The task of creation, simple, repetitive, and small, shielded her from despair. One might measure the course of a life by the number of silent nights spent at work. Mrs. Pratt died in spring. The funeral was modest. Rain streaked the glass of the chapel. The apprentice stood apart, feeling both gratitude and emptiness. There was no inheritance, only the memory of craft. Yet with it came an invisible gift: independence. She rented a threadbare room near the market and hung a simple sign written by hand: "Millinery Repairs and Alterations." A beginning as frail as a silk ribbon, but it carried her name. Days blurred into seasons again. The shop smelled of straw and candle wax. A few neighbors brought their caps for mending. One left behind a spool of French ribbon, which she later trimmed into something graceful. Word spread slowly, as it does in cramped quarters. Her humor, quiet and quick, attracted returning customers. The young laundresses liked her wit, the older women, her discretion. Each coin she earned, she weighed carefully, one for rent, one for her mother's medicine, one set aside in a tin box that dreamed of a better future. In the evenings, when she closed her shutters against the fog, she thought about the hats she made. They went off to accompany lives far different from hers, to churches, dinners, dances. They might witness proposals, quarrels, betrayals. Each creation lived beyond her reach. That thought stirred both pride and melancholy. To serve beauty, but never partake in its rewards, required humility of a special sort, the humility of those who labor unseen. London's nights were never truly dark. Even in the poorest alleys, light leaked from taverns, reflecting off puddles and carriage lamps. Sometimes she lingered by the window, sewing one last seam, wondering what it might mean to live in such a city, where every face hid a private story, and the difference between truth and appearance could be as thin as the silk she held. She sensed, though she could not name it, that knowing when to listen might one day matter as much as knowing when to speak. And so her youth passed quietly, measured in ribbons sold, evenings survived, bits of laughter saved between hours of work. She gained a calm confidence, born of necessity. Life was a series of brims to be minded, each demanding care. In time she would learn how even the smallest of careful acts could bend destiny toward grace. For now, her world remained the humble workshop, thread, straw, and the faint, lingering echo of Mrs. Pratt's voice, saying, as ever, "Mind the brim." Morning light filtered through the gauzy curtain like watered milk, settling on a cluttered work table where scraps of ribbon lay curled beside a chipped teacup. The milliner's workshop had changed little since she first hung her sign, yet its air held a quiet confidence now. The faint scent of starch and lavender blended with glue and fabric dust, an alchemy of patience. London outside was a hum of carts and hooves, but within these few square yards she had carved an island of her own making. Life at that age moved with both certainty and caution. Her days began before the bells of St. Clement's chimed their slow first notes. She would sweep the narrow step, tap the creaking sign straight again, and set a pale straw bonnet in the front window. In the reflection of the glass, she often caught her own face. It looked older than she expected, though composed, like a woman accustomed to weighing small risks. The cost of a spool, the trust in a client's promise to pay, the friendship of another tradesperson that might, in its own way, prove more costly than a debt. Her hands bore fine needle marks that never really healed. They testified to her trade, small sacrifices for livelihood and dignity. The world seldom noticed work like hers, but she found order in repetition. Needles passed through fabric, seasons turned through fog and drizzle, and ambition crept in quietly, stitched between chores. She dreamed, as she worked, of someday owning not just a corner shop, but a parlor where finely dressed ladies would wait for fittings and whisper their secrets over tea. All dreams, even modest ones, require an appetite equal to their patience. The people around her gave color to that routine. There was Mrs. Hanley, a widow who sold lace from a basket and had a tongue sharp enough to cut thread. There was Amos, the printer's assistant next door, whose ink-stained fingers and curious eyes unsettled her in an undefined way. He brought her newspapers occasionally, not the expensive kind, but half-faded sheets discarded after proofing. From them she learned of the wars abroad, factory strikes, and scandals that filled unkind gossip columns. The city was larger than the streets, she knew, yet she felt no envy toward it, only a mild fascination, as if reading about a play that never truly ended. Amos had a habit of standing in her doorway when the day's work drove him outside for air. "You live too quietly," he once said, smiling, his fingertips still smudged with ink. She had only shrugged, half amused, for quiet living was the only kind she could afford. He would sometimes recite a line from a leaflet he'd just printed, something about liberty or industry, and she would listen politely before returning to her stitching. Words were his fabric. Her world was material. Yet their friendship softened the edges of her solitude. When supplies ran short, he fetched them from the market. When a burdened client's account was long overdue, he stood by silently while she spoke with measured authority. At times, she wondered if his kindness carried unspoken meaning, but neither pressed the subject. Life had taught her to prefer cautions over certainties. Even affection, when unacknowledged, could remain safe. Her shop gradually drew modest notice. The wives of clerks and petty officials trusted her discretion and admired her ability to mimic the fashions of wealth with simpler materials. Each week she experimented, dyeing ribbons with the juice of blackberries, or shaping brims just slightly wider than the last style demanded. Word spread from one satisfied customer to another, and with each visit came the delicate ritual of conversation. Some women confided their worries about rent or husbands. Others prattled about servants. She listened more than she spoke, preserving each tale like a pressed flower, flattened, fragile, but fragrant with truth. One afternoon she visited her mother, now too frail to work. The old woman's hands trembled as she held the hat her daughter had made from leftover felt. "You could sell this for half a sovereign," she murmured. "You give too much away." The younger woman smiled, avoiding reply. There are certain reproaches that belong to love. Answering them would only break their tender meaning. She left a small purse of coins on the windowsill before returning home in the evening mist. Her mother's room smelled of soap and wet linen, the scent of her childhood, softened by the years. That night, rain tapped against the roof like someone persistent but polite. She sat by the tiny stove, reading one of Amos's discarded newspapers. It mentioned an increase in taxes for imports, a speech in Parliament about trade reform. She thought of the rich ladies who paid 3 guineas for a French bonnet, while she reused ribbons from worn dresses. Inequality, to her, was not an argument in essays, but a fact of leathered hands and aching feet at the end of the day. Yet, rather than bitterness, she felt only a strange calm. Life owed her nothing. The city never promised fairness, only survival. The wisdom of the poor is to want without resentment. As business steadied, she hired a neighbor's daughter to help sweep and cut. The girl hummed at her work, tuning the silence of the shop into something lighter. Those younger eyes admired her as an artist might admire a craftswoman, though she laughed at the notion. Hats were not art, she said, merely a clever answer to vanity. But sometimes, while arranging a velvet plume or selecting the tint of a ribbon, she sensed that her labor touched something gentler, something that dignified what was otherwise invisible. Each evening she placed one finished bonnet in the display window under the glow of a single candle. Its flame trembled in the draught, reflected on the glass until the whole street seemed to shimmer. She liked to think of passers-by looking in and imagining the life of the maker they would never meet. Perhaps that imagination was her substitute for fame. Some people hunger to be known. Others find comfort in remaining unnamed, yet understood through their work. With success came new challenges. Suppliers demanded advance payment. Rents crept upward. She learned the art of negotiation, the long pause, the level gaze, the subtle hint that one's patience could easily mean taking work elsewhere. Even power had its small degrees, and a steady voice was the only weapon allowed her. Occasionally, a constable passed by, tipping his hat out of courtesy, and she felt both visible and safe. London's rules were firm, but they left space for perseverance. By midsummer, her window had become a small attraction. Bridesmaid bonnets in cream and pale blush lined the display, drawing women who dreamed of gentility, even if only for a Sunday. She took pride in giving them that illusion. There is kindness, after all, in dressing hope. Yet when the bustle faded at dusk, and she tidied the floor alone, a restless question returned. Was this all life would give her? Work, mild respect, and solitude repeating like stitches. The thought never quite left her, but neither did it consume her. The mind, shaped by hardship, learns to fold itself rather than break. One evening Amos arrived, holding a sprig of lavender wrapped in paper from his press. "For the scent, not the words," he said lightly. She placed it in a jar near the window. The fragrance mingled with glue and cloth for days afterward, and something in her heart eased. Still, she hid that tenderness beneath humor and reserve. Kindness, when too freely shown, could invite misreading or pity, and she would allow neither. Her tone stayed measured, her laughter reserved for the ordinary absurdities of the street. When autumn came, leaves collected in the gutter like letters never posted. She walked to church more often, not for faith's ecstasy, but for its stillness. The words from the pulpit seemed less about salvation than about rhythm, what one must do, and then do again tomorrow. Survival, she realized, was made of liturgy disguised as habit. Each prayer echoed her own private vow: to work honestly, to trust carefully, to guard her goodness against both pride and despair. Though she seldom thought of the future in grand terms, an invisible thread united her days. Somewhere, within the hum of trade and talk, a faint sense stirred, that life held hidden meanings, murmured between ordinary words if one simply listened with care. When she trimmed a bonnet for a visiting actress who paid double without asking, she caught a glimpse of that delicate balance between performance and truth. The actress left a laugh and a lingering perfume behind. Both vanished quickly, yet they left the milliner thoughtful. The city, she decided, was a book written in whispers. And late at night, when gaslights flared across the procession of hansom cabs, and the shutters of her shop were bolted, the modest window stayed warm beneath its candle. A ribbon rested there, a length of rose silk catching the yellow glow. It fluttered faintly as if breathing, a small promise against the dark. She leaned for a moment on the counter, tired but content, listening to the wind's murmur through the cracks. Somewhere beyond the glass, the streets kept their secrets. Within, among shadows of fabric and thread, she felt the peace of having earned another quiet day. London that spring was bathed in mist that refused to lift. The city seemed caught between seasons, its streets damp with thawing frost, its sky the color of pewter. In the market lanes, water dripped from awnings like slow clocks, marking each hesitant hour. Inside the milliner's shop, the air was warmer, scented faintly of starch, dye, and faded flowers. Work had multiplied in recent months, and her reputation had lifted quietly, like steam from a kettle. The window now displayed not just bonnets of practical straw, but hats trimmed with imported lace, pale feathers, and subtle ornament. They caught the glances of ladies descending from carriages, where once only clerks' wives had paused. She managed her own apprentices now, 2 young women, quick with scissors and laughter. They filled the air with chatter, yet understood that silence would fall the instant a wealthy customer crossed the threshold. That silence was its own kind of music, composed of restraint, observation, and invisible caution. Years of practice had taught her how to watch without being seen, to note details, the gloved hand that fidgeted, the sigh behind polite small talk. Skill alone was not enough in her trade. One needed discretion as fine as silk thread. It was on such a morning, thick with fog and candle smoke, that she received a message written in neat, slanted handwriting on heavy paper. Lady Armitage requests a private consultation this afternoon. The name was known to her, whispered often in fashionable circles. The lady was wife to a rising official, admired for his integrity and feared for his temper. To be summoned by such a household was an honor, yet one to approach gingerly. Orders of that scale could sustain her shop for a month, or ruin it should she misstep. She packed her measuring tape, ribbons, and sample fabrics in a wicker case, then set off along the Strand, careful to avoid puddles that mirrored gray skies. The city felt unknowable that day, its buildings faint apparitions in the haze. Coaches passed, their wheels whispering like conspirators. She noticed men in fine coats conversing quietly under the arcade, their breath clouding in the chill. London fed on secrets. She sensed it in the very air. Lady Armitage's townhouse stood beyond St. James's, where doors gleamed with polish and curtains concealed more than daylight. A footman led her through a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of wax and perfume, into a drawing room bright with mirrors. The lady herself sat near the fire, her jewels arranged as if by intention rather than vanity. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the calm of one unaccustomed to refusal. "I require a hat suitable for an evening at the theater," she said, "something that speaks of restraint, yet assures attention." The milliner nodded, rehearsing her questions about size and taste. Work demanded deference. As she fitted the band around the lady's brow, careful not to disturb the powdered curls, 2 men entered, clearly confident that servants and craftswomen were invisible. They spoke low, with the assurance of those whose words hold weight. She did not understand at first what they discussed. Phrases about tidings from the continent and letters through Antwerp. But one sentence, casual as breath, froze her hands mid-measure. "The dispatch will bring the list by Thursday. His Majesty must not learn before." Lady Armitage had waved them silent with a faint smile, but the air had already changed. Our milliner's instinct, sharpened by years of listening to trivial secrets, recognized the tone that separates gossip from danger. The moment passed quickly. The men withdrew, their boots swallowed by the carpet. The lady noticed the interruption only as fashion permitted, an elegant sigh, a comment about unreliable messengers. Yet beneath the veneer, discomfort hummed like a note struck out of tune. The fitting ended soon after. Payment was promised, with a request for confidentiality naturally expected in matters of taste. She curtsied, heart steady, though her thoughts trembled. A craftswoman survives not by courage, but by composure. Outside, the fog had thickened into rain. Each droplet struck the brim of her bonnet with steady precision. as if to remind her that reality need not be dramatic to be cruel. She walked home through the dripping labyrinth of lanes, repeating the overheard words without meaning to. The language of treason was not something she had sought, yet it clung to her mind like stray thread. His Majesty must not learn before... Before what? A delivery? A betrayal? The very questions unsettled her. In that age, loose speech could destroy lives no less swiftly than sharpened blades. By evening, she had nearly convinced herself to forget it. The city coined new rumors every hour. What right had she to interpret one? She lit her small lamp and resumed work, trimming violet ribbon for a bonnet requested by a modest clerk's wife. Yet thought would not yield to habit. In each shadow she sensed the shape of some greater pattern she could neither name nor escape. To know something half-hidden is to bear a strange burden. It promises both fear and revelation. In the days that followed, she forced herself into routine. The apprentices laughed over spilled dye. Customers came and went. Amos, the printer's assistant, visited with his usual smile, carrying a folded newspaper under his arm. He remarked that Parliament was more quarrelsome than usual. She hesitated, then asked what sort of disputes might involve dispatches from abroad. His brow furrowed in surprise, but he answered lightly, unaware of her motive. "Trade charters, mostly. Some say trouble's brewing, though no one dares name it yet." He left with a cheerful nod, but her mind lingered on his words. That night, unable to sleep, she took a candle to her work table and spread out her fabrics. Every pattern, every stitch, seemed charged with hidden meaning. How curious, she thought, that the simplest objects, lace, ribbon, netting, could conceal a world of silence. In her own way, she practiced secrecy daily. The quiet knowing of clients' troubles, the unspoken lines between servant and master. But this was different. The knowledge she carried now felt like an object she could neither drop nor display. It weighed nothing and everything. Weeks passed. Lady Armitage's hat was completed. Black satin edged with discreet pearls. When the box was delivered, the footman pressed a sealed envelope into her hands with unusual gravity. Inside was a note of thanks and a folded banknote larger than she expected. Gratitude, she supposed, or perhaps payment for silence. The thought offended and comforted her at once. She placed the money aside but kept the envelope. It bore a faint scent of rosewater and something else. A trace of foreign tobacco, faint but distinct. She tucked it into a cupboard, unsure why she could not throw it away. Her dreams grew restless. At times, she imagined men following her through the market, or pausing too long outside the shop. It might have been fancy. London's shadows often played tricks on the weary. Yet superstition had always lived among the working class, a belief that omens walked among street sounds and sudden chills. She found herself whispering small prayers under her breath, half out of fear, half habit. Conscience, when inconvenienced, often dresses itself as superstition. One Sunday she met Amos by the river's edge, where the smell of tar and silt mingled with fresh rain. He spoke of a pamphlet being censored by authorities for unpatriotic tone. She listened, hardly breathing. The tremor of politics had reached even his modest press. When he noticed her unease, she changed the subject with a modest laugh. It is difficult to explain dread born from a whisper. Even the attempt to share it seems disloyal to reason. By the close of that spring, the sense of change had settled quietly around her. Orders continued, yet the faces of certain customers reappeared too often, their inquiries too polite. She began to notice coded gestures, an exchanged glance, a deliberate mention of specific fabrics from Antwerp. It could be coincidence, she told herself. Yet sometimes the heart perceives connections the mind denies. She stayed late every evening, as if work could ward off worry, stitching in near darkness until thread and thought tangled together. One evening, while sweeping up, her hand brushed the edge of Lady Armitage's envelope hidden in the cupboard. She unfolded it, staring again at the rosewater stain and the elegant handwriting. Some lines between survival and conscience cannot be drawn until crossed. She stood there motionless, listening to the muffled din of London, the clatter of cartwheels, the faint song from a nearby tavern, the endless breathing of the city that demanded silence from all who served it. The candle burned low, guttering slightly. She set the envelope aside and closed the shutters. It was not guilt she felt, nor curiosity, but something slower and deeper, the first awareness that her careful, honest life was no longer wholly her own. Outside, the fog thickened again, swallowing alleys, lamps, and every certainty. Somewhere within that gray expanse, the echo of those half-heard words lingered, quiet as a needle passing through cloth, binding her future to a secret she had never sought to learn. The fog had lifted by summer, though London's air still hung heavy with smoke and commerce. The milliner's days resumed their habitual pattern, needles gleaming in lamplight, thread trailing like faint music. But a quiet unease threaded through her thoughts. Work no longer offered the old refuge. Each fitting, each polite conversation carried a subtle tension she could not name aloud. The secret she had overheard months before had not faded. It lived quietly beneath her work table like a sleeping beast, patient and unseen. She sometimes traced the curve of a hat's brim and wondered how much truth a mind could hold before it began to warp under the shape of silence. The city seemed to share her restlessness. Slogans appeared overnight in chalk on walls. Uniformed men stood longer on street corners. Even the tone of customers' gossip had changed, less of ribbons and fashion, more of rumors. The war on the continent had ended, yet whispers of unrest scattered through parlors like dust motes in sunlight. People with fine titles fretted over security, while those without titles spoke of bread. Her own life, meanwhile, had grown slightly more comfortable. The shop prospered. Her apprentices worked steadily, and Amos still visited between deliveries. He spoke less of politics now, aware perhaps that the world beyond their small street had grown brittle. One afternoon he brought a piece of printed paper, an invitation to a gathering of tradespeople discussing new taxes. "You should come," he said. "Your work depends on these tariffs." She thanked him, folded the paper carefully, and placed it in a box. Practical concerns could wait. She had seen too much of what talk could do. He watched her with faint disappointment, though he did not press her. The first outward sign that something had shifted came in the form of an unusual order. A gentleman's valet, immaculately dressed, arrived requesting 2 identical bonnets, same color, same measurement, same decoration down to the last stitch. He left a generous deposit in gold, more than the cost warranted. She accepted without comment. Yet, when he turned to leave, she noticed a small emblem sewn into his coat lining, a crest she faintly recognized from a document Amos had once printed for a political club. She told herself it meant nothing, though the thought returned like a splinter. That evening, she worked later than usual. The shop was quiet, except for the soft scratching of scissors and the faint rumble of carriages outside. Her apprentices had long gone home. On her table lay the two half-finished bonnets, pale and symmetrical. But the perfection disturbed her. They seemed like pieces in a plan she did not yet see. The candle burned low. When she reached for her shears, her sleeve brushed against Lady Armitage's old envelope resting on the shelf, its seal now cracked but unopened. The memory of that voice, "His Majesty must not learn before," echoed faintly. Some truths resist forgetting, simply because they have nowhere else to live. The following day she visited the cloth merchant in Holborn, hoping routine would steady her thoughts. The narrow street was crowded with drays, stacked with bales and the rhythmic shouts of porters. While she waited for her order, she overheard two men discussing a series of pamphlets printed abroad, delivered through smugglers hidden in shipments of silks and lace. "I come through Antwerp again," one said. "Better hidden this time." The phrase struck her so sharply she nearly dropped her parcel. Antwerp. The same word she had heard in that drawing room months before. She left the shop quickly, her purchase grasped tight, as though the air itself had turned untrustworthy. For days she wrestled with a quiet dread. To tell anyone seemed absurd. Who would believe a milliner's half-heard gossip? Yet to ignore it felt cowardly. She considered speaking to Amos, but caution sealed her lips. His work already skirted danger. Printers were often accused of sedition for smaller things. Protecting him, she told herself, meant silence. Still, curiosity, the gentle vice of the thoughtful, worked its way through her resolve. When the valet returned to retrieve the identical bonnets, she asked whether he served Lady Armitage's household. His expression did not shift, yet his reply came a shade too leisurely. "For a friend of the family." Politeness covered the gap where truth should have been. He tipped his hat and departed, leaving her more certain that coincidence had long since departed from her story. That night, she sought the one comfort left to her, work. The apprentices had gone, and rain beat steadily against the window. She rearranged fabrics, trying to quiet her mind by motion. Then she noticed something strange. One bonnet had a faint mark beneath the lining, a small thread pattern unlike her own hand. She unpicked it carefully and found a narrow strip of parchment sewn into the seam. The writing was nearly invisible, thin as spiderweb, numbers and initials she did not recognize. Her pulse quickened. She wrapped it swiftly in brown paper and hid it among her own bills before anyone might stumble upon it. By dawn she made a decision neither brave nor foolish, merely inevitable. Secrets, when discovered by accident, demand caretakers, whether one wills it or not. She told no one, not even Amos. When the valet returned again 2 days later, restless and impatient, she handed him both bonnets, one of which now lacked the hidden scrap. He counted payment quickly, never meeting her eyes. As the door shut behind him, she felt a wave of quiet triumph, tinged with fear. Whatever game they were playing, she had removed one small piece from its board. The paper itself remained unreadable. She studied it under lamplight, tracing the dim marks, wondering if they formed a code or supply list. It seemed harmless, a fragment adrift from a larger design, but her instincts whispered otherwise. She placed it carefully inside an old ledger between accounts of ribbons sold and feathers purchased, as if the practical might disguise the perilous. Habit became her shield once more. Weeks later, rumors flared through the district. Officials questioned merchants about seditious materials. Arrests were whispered in the printing quarter. Amos mentioned that his employer had been briefly detained and released. His smile was thinner than before, his hands ink-stained yet tremulous. She asked nothing, though compassion shone plainly in her eyes. He noticed, and for a long silence the noise of London seemed to retreat. The unspoken understanding between them, trust built on reticence, was perhaps the truest companionship either possessed. Still, one evening, as they closed their shutters side by side, he murmured, "Strange how paper causes more fear than swords." She looked up, startled, but his tone remained casual. "We print opinions and tremble at their echoes," he said, half to himself. Then he wished her good night and vanished into the fog. She locked the door gently, her mind repeating those words long after. Late that night she removed the hidden scrap from the ledger and held it over the light. The ink shimmered faintly, invisible phrases appearing when warmed. She could distinguish only fragments, list, thurs, and a symbol that might have been a crown crossed by a line. She blew out the candle quickly, frightened by her own daring. Knowledge, once glimpsed, burns hotter than flame. Days bled into slow uncertainty. Rain returned, and with it the comfort of routine. She supervised fittings, thanked customers, laughed softly when the younger apprentice nicked her finger. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Yet beneath the calm hum of work, a current flowed. Each errand, each new order carried a shadow of suspicion. When a uniformed officer entered her shop one morning seeking hats for his wife, she nearly dropped her measuring tape. His courteous tone barely reached her through the rush of blood in her ears. But he asked only about the price of muslin, not justice. That evening she found herself standing by the window long after closing. Street lamps flickered in the thin rain, blurring the outlines of buildings into watercolor shapes. Somewhere, carriages clattered toward Westminster, carrying men whose decisions rippled into the lives of those who stitched and carried and waited. She thought of Lady Armitage, of the valet, of the parchment hidden now in her drawer. Threads, she considered, always lead somewhere. The question is, who dares follow them? When the clock struck midnight, she returned to her work table, smoothing the fabric laid out for tomorrow's clients. The night was quiet, except for the breathing of the city through its countless unseen mouths. She whispered a small thought, barely more than a prayer, that caution might guard not only her body, but also her conscience. For kindness, though concealed beneath practicality, still guided her. In the end, a milliner's hands cannot unlearn gentleness. Even fear, in her keeping, must be stitched with care. And so she worked until her slight shadow merged with the candles. London outside whispered sleeplessly, but inside her small room order reigned again. Thread through cloth, stitch after stitch, the oldest form of patience, binding not only hats, but the fragile seams between innocence and knowing. By autumn, London's river had turned the color of tarnished pewter. The damp rose from its banks, mixing with the coil of smoke from factories and kitchen chimneys. In such air, everything seemed to soften. The outlines of buildings, the sound of footsteps, even the edge of thought. Trade was brisk that season. Carriages lined the theater streets, and fashionable women reappeared in their plumes and adornments as though war and hunger had been dreams best forgotten. Yet beneath the polished carapace of the city, small unease lingered, the kind only those who work in the margins can smell. A faint note of danger, sharp as vinegar under perfume. The milliner kept her shutters open longer now, not purely for business, but out of habit or watchfulness. The window's reflection comforted her. It told her where the real ended and the imagined began. Her apprentices whispered that her eyes had changed, that she looked as though always listening for something only she could hear. They were not wrong. Ever since the scrap of parchment came into her keeping, every sound carried hidden meaning. The creak of a cart could be pursuit. A distant church bell might mask a signal. Her life, however, required that she remain outwardly serene. Clients came with calm faces and crisp manners, seeking elegance without effort. Some were new, strangers bearing familiar accents. Others were old patrons, now strangely cautious, their visits shorter. Among the latter was Lady Armitage, her poise unbroken, yet her tone clipped. The lady requested a simple bonnet trimmed in black braid, nothing too noticeable, and left payment in advance. As she departed, her perfume clung to the air. Amber and apprehension mingled in equal measure. The milliner sensed a woman practiced in silence, not for modesty's sake, but for survival. After that visit came a morning when Amos arrived unannounced, his face pale and streaked with worry. He spoke softly, like one who knew walls held ears. "There have been searches in the printing quarter," he said. "2 men seized for transporting pamphlets hidden inside cloth bales." His voice trembled, not from fear alone, but from recognition. The description he gave, the Antwerp silks, the foreign accounting initials, matched the code she had once glimpsed on the tiny parchment. She listened without a word. Denial, she had learned, was safer than confession. For days, her thoughts circled the same question, whether the scrap she'd hidden held names now imprisoned or spared them. The decision to act or remain still pressed on her like an unspoken prayer. Yet action for someone of her station carried no promise of justice, only peril. The city's laws were not written for those who lived above their shops. Still, her conscience pricked at her, small, persistent, and inconvenient as a dropped bead beneath a work table. One evening, while sorting fabrics, she found another strange pattern, an order for a dozen modest bonnets, addressed to no name, only an initial and a location near the docks. The handwriting matched that of the earlier request. She hesitated, then packed the order as usual, but marked one box with a thread different in shade, a trick only she would know. Perhaps she meant nothing by it. Perhaps she hoped someone honest might notice. The gesture itself offered the hollow comfort of participation in a fate she could neither unravel nor avoid. The world outside her modest shop grew stranger. Men with official seals inspected wagons, yet contraband still moved unseen. Gossip swelled like fog between taverns and tailor shops. Above such chatter, London carried its ancient indifference, organ music from churches, vendors shouting over rain, laughter spilling from tavern doors. She walked home through it all as though through a dream she feared to wake from. At night, exhaustion withdrew her defenses. She dreamed of hats turning into wheels, of ribbons twisting into words she could not read. Each morning, the fears faded. leaving that thin residue of knowing, a sense that something vast and invisible was tightening its weave around her. Still, she tended her work with precision. Customers trusted steadiness, and steadiness she could supply, even when peace eluded her heart. It was during one of those slow afternoons that she met the visitor who would unbalance her caution once again. He came without introduction, tall, well-spoken, claiming to be a merchant seeking custom for a new line of imported fabrics. His voice was smooth as polished stone, his questions seemingly harmless. Yet he spoke the name Antwerp with peculiar ease, as if testing its sound on her tongue. She answered with measured politeness, feigning dullness. When he had gone, she locked the door, trembling. Beneath his courteous mask, she had recognized the rhythm of authority, the tone of one who interrogates gently only before deciding whether to accuse. Amos noticed her unease later that week. "You're thinner," he said quietly as he handed her a proof sheet for a handbill. "The city can wear a person down. You should let someone else close the shop for a night." His concern warmed her, though she feigned detachment. Compassion, when freely offered, still embarrassed her. Yet that night, as wind rattled the shutters, she thought of him again, his inky fingers, his stubborn honesty. Against the gray tide of London, he seemed a small warmth she dared not lose. Still, she kept her distance. Fear teaches careful affection. The next morning, officials returned to search a warehouse nearby. Talk of informants filled the street. She wondered how long discretion could shield her. That evening she opened her ledger and stared at the hidden parchment lying between shop accounts. For a moment, she considered throwing it into the fire, letting it vanish in one clean gesture. But conscience hesitated, caught between destruction and evidence. If burned, the truth would vanish. If kept, it might one day clarify the shadow surrounding her. She replaced it quietly and blew out the light. Weeks drifted by. Rain softened into chill mist again. She worked steadily, watched the apprentices marry, and kept her routines intact as though rituals could anchor safety. Yet even small things betrayed tremors of change. Orders dwindled. Letters from certain clients ceased. One afternoon she glimpsed Lady Armitage crossing the opposite pavement, heavily veiled, ignoring every greeting. That image stayed with her, a proud woman reduced to caution, proof that fear respects no elegance. Toward winter, Amos came once more at dusk. In his pocket lay a printed notice warning that anyone withholding information concerning foreign correspondence would face prosecution. "They mean to purge half the trade," he said bitterly. She nodded, feeling the dry edge of inevitability. He rested his hand briefly on the counter. "Whatever you know, best forget," he whispered. There was no accusation in his tone, only understanding. She almost told him then, but words stuck like thread tangled in a needle's eye. When he left, she wished she'd been braver, not to confess guilt, but to trust another with what haunted her days. That night, thunder rolled above the city, though no rain fell. Streets emptied early, even taverns darkened sooner than usual. From her window she saw a figure pause beneath the nearest lamp, watch her shop for a moment, then vanish into the mist. Whether it was a constable, a messenger, or an echo of her own imagination, she would never know. Yet as she stood there, candle shaking slightly in her hand, she felt that the walls around her had thinned, as if life itself were peering in. Morning found her calm again. She unfolded new fabric, soft French satin, pale and luminous. and laid out her tools. Habit triumphs over fear, as faith never can. Still, as she cut and stitched, her mind moved elsewhere, to the unknown men at the docks, the stripped warehouses, and Amos's warnings. Her own life, once governed by simple exchange, labor for coin, service for trust, had blurred into transactions of secrecy. Every honest act now seemed the shadow of another, half-seen one. She worked until light failed, then stepped outside for air. The city smelled of coal and coming frost. Somewhere a church bell struck, deep and deliberate, marking another evening surrendered to both routine and suspense. For a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to be free of knowledge, to live again as when her greatest worry had been the price of ribbon. But innocence, once bartered even in ignorance, cannot be repurchased. Inside, the candle burned down to its final inch. She tidied her table, folded a length of black silk, and touched the old ledger where the hidden parchment lay. Its presence no longer startled her. It had become part of her daily geography, like a scar, half forgotten, yet present beneath skin. Outside, the fog began to thicken again, swallowing the sounds of London one by one. She watched it creep close, calm despite herself. Secrets, she knew now, were not accidents of fate, but instruments the world uses to test its quieter souls. And she, though unwilling, had proven steady enough to hold one through another lonely season. The year turned cold with a suddenness that caught the city off guard. Frost lay on the shop's window each morning, like faint handwriting only the dawn could read. The milliner rose earlier now, lighting the stove with numb fingers, waiting for the brittle air to soften. She found comfort in repetition, the same matches struck, the same kettle singing, the same slow bloom of warmth that turned the world bearable again. Only inside her mind did the routine falter. Thoughts bent around one question: how long one could keep silent before silence itself became complicity. Orders dwindled with the season. Many of her wealthier customers had gone to the country, seeking clearer skies and distance from unrest. Those who remained moved cautiously, as if words cost more than coins. Even Lady Armitage no longer sent for fittings. Instead came letters in new hands, unsigned, requesting simple wares and fast delivery. The milliner complied without comment. Trust had become a fragile currency. Her trade survived partly through invisibility, and invisibility demanded obedience. Amos visited less often now. He confessed that his employer had fled London after repeated raids on print shops. The government's fear of sedition had turned printers into suspects overnight. He looked older, thinner, but his manner remained kind. When she offered him tea beside the stove, they sat in companionable quiet. Two workers weighed down not by guilt, but by the fatigue of living near those who carried it. "You should stay clear of these things," he said softly. "The city burns its own secrets, and sometimes those close by catch the flame." She smiled faintly, not answering. Their friendship had settled into a rhythm of unsaid understanding, equal parts affection and restraint. Winter deepened. Each evening she drew the curtains earlier, wary of silhouettes that loitered too long across the street. One night, a knock startled her, a constable bringing news that a shopkeeper nearby had been questioned for unlicensed correspondence. All he wanted was information about fabric shipments and foreign clients, yet in his formal tone she heard the echo of accusation. She answered politely, inwardly steady though her pulse quickened. When he left, she locked the door and stood for a long time in darkness. The world outside her shutters had acquired a hunger for evidence, and even innocence could serve as proof if found in the wrong drawer. Days passed. She worked with outward calm, though her hands grew rough from constant washing. She feared ink or dust might betray what she had once hidden. The parchment fragment remained folded inside its ledger. Each time she balanced accounts, she avoided that page, as though the paper watched her and waited. Secrecy was no longer the simple act of withholding speech. It had become a presence, quiet yet alive, sharing space with her tools, her breath, her weariness. The apprentices sensed unease but dared not ask. One of them left abruptly after an invitation to work elsewhere. The remaining girl hummed at her tasks to fill the silence. In those faint tunes, the milliner heard the memory of her own youth, when ambition had been a clean longing, untouched by consequence. Now her successes seemed tarnished, each coin earned, shadowed by knowledge unspent. One evening, the old ledgers slipped from a shelf and fell open on the hidden page. The paper slipped out, fluttering under the table like a trapped moth. She hesitated before picking it up. The ink had faded, but one symbol, half crown, half cross, still showed clearly. She pressed the sheet flat beneath her hand and felt anger rise, not at those who had written it, but at fate for placing it within her keeping. To know something dangerous, yet be powerless to act, that was the true cruelty of life among the powerless. She folded it again and went to the hearth. The flame danced expectantly. Yet as she held the paper above it, something stayed her. Perhaps pity for those caught deeper in the web, perhaps stubborn curiosity. Instead, she slid the paper into a length of ribbon, stitched it shut, and placed it among finished orders bound for delivery. If the note carried danger, it would move back toward its makers, away from her shop. A form of justice, quiet and imperfect, yet her own. 2 days later, she learned that a messenger who handled such deliveries had been arrested. Nothing linked back to her, though fear pressed its cold palm against her throat. The apprentices gossiped about the raids. She feigned indifference. Yet that night she sat without moving, the fire dying slowly, wondering whom her decision had spared or condemned. Her conscience turned restlessly. Kindness, she realized, offered little shelter once tangled with misjudged mercy. Weeks slipped into a fragile calm. The constables stopped visiting. London's mood softened with the thaw, though rumor persisted like smoke long after fire. She resumed full trade, greeting clients with practiced warmth. Still, new habits betrayed lingering caution. She avoided long conversation, kept records sparse, refused work that seemed too urgent. Even laughter, when it came, sounded foreign to her ears, as if borrowed from another woman's life. Amos returned near the first signs of spring. His beard showed the week's fatigue, and ink stained even the cuffs of his clean shirt. He brought news that the worst of the crackdown had passed, that Parliament had tired of persecuting pamphleteers once the headlines grew dull. She listened, relief light but fragile. Then he asked the one question she feared. "Did they ever come here?" "No," she replied, too quickly. His gaze lingered, gentle but measuring. Perhaps he sensed more than she said, yet he let silence settle between them like dust on paper. Before leaving, he placed a folded leaflet on her counter, an unsigned piece about the dignity of honest work and the cost of fear. When she read it that night, the words struck deep. The mouth that speaks kindness must first learn silence, but silence kept too long becomes a wound. She traced the sentence until the ink smudged beneath her finger. Soon after, a small notice arrived by private courier, a commission for mourning hats from a modest household. The handwriting was familiar but uncertain. Lady Armitage's, though the lines wavered. The letter mentioned her husband's sudden illness and requested the milliner's discretion, as always. The request stirred both compassion and warning. She made the hats carefully, pure black with narrow ribbons, the kind worn not to invite sympathy, but to satisfy propriety. While she trimmed the last one, she thought of the secret life that had crossed hers and of how easily misused ambition feeds upon trust. Delivery day brought gray skies and light drizzle. The footman who met her was unfamiliar, his politeness rehearsed. The townhouse looked dimmed, shutters drawn, silence pressing through the air. Payment was exact, gratitude brief. She returned home, uneasy. That evening, a rumor reached her through a visiting clerk's wife. The late official's papers had been seized, his household under scrutiny. The cause of death uncertain. The lady had disappeared to relatives in the north. For a long time, the milliner stood by her empty window, the city's hum faint in the fog. She felt no triumph, only the tired clarity that knowledge always ends in solitude. Weeks passed again. Early blossoms appeared in market stalls, pale and tentative. Business revived. She worked diligently, her movements slower but steadier. The world seemed determined as ever to continue, yet her view of it had changed subtly. She now measured people by their silences rather than their words, by what they dared not confess even to themselves. When Amos came one last time before moving to another district, they shared a quiet meal of bread and broth. The simplicity of it felt sacred in a city that traded comfort for intrigue. He spoke of starting his own press, somewhere smaller, where ideas might breathe without peril. "You've the patience of 3 lives," he told her, half smiling. She laughed lightly, for the first time without effort. After he left, she tidied the kitchen and paused beside the shelf where the old ledger had once lain. It was empty now. She had burned the parchment days before, watching its ash curl into fine gray threads. The act had brought no revelation, only subtle peace. Some secrets die properly only when the hands that guard them decide to let go. Outside, the frost had melted from the rooftops. Water dripped steadily into the gutter like stitches pulling the world back together. She opened the window just a little, letting the cold air in. The city's murmur drifted up, voices, hooves, the faint laughter of children echoing off the stones. Life, indifferent yet forgiving, was beginning again. London's summer began without ceremony, nights lighter, air warmer yet restless, like a city pretending it had never known fear. Markets reopened, theaters filled, and the hum of industry swelled back through the streets. Beneath that surface murmur, however, the residue of suspicion clung, as invisible and persistent as the soot that coated every window pane. The milliner's shop had survived the turbulence unscathed, yet those who passed her door would not have imagined how quietly a whole secret history slept behind its calm display of ribbons and straw. Work thrived again. She taught new apprentices the careful art of shaping and trimming felt, of balancing form against modesty. To them, she seemed unshakable, a master of routine, impervious to distraction. Yet even in composure, there remained a kind of fatigue. The winter had left behind not only fear, but a warped sense of faith. Trust, though rebuilt, carried the faint aftertaste of regret. She often wondered whether quiet endurance might itself be a form of deception, one performed so well that even the soul forgets it is acting. One June afternoon, a postwriter brought a folded letter with no return name. Its ink, faint and hurried, blurred slightly where damp had touched the edge. She set aside her shears before opening it. The contents were short. A request for her presence on a matter concerning former clients, signed by a magistrate of the Crown. The address pointed to Westminster, too formal, too dangerous to ignore. She read the note twice before folding it back neatly. The air around her seemed suddenly thinner, as if every stitch in the room had tightened at once. In the days leading to the summons, she worked in silence. Her mind moved through each fear clearly, like a seamstress tracing a pattern before cutting. Perhaps this was about Lady Armitage. Perhaps about the papers that had passed secretly through her shop. But perhaps, she thought, it was fate offering her a small redemption to speak what she knew and end the long wait of secrecy. That idea frightened and steadied her in equal measure. When the morning arrived, she dressed plainly, neither humble nor defiant. Westminster at daylight smelled of wax and dust, corridors long and echoing. The magistrate himself proved less menacing than imagined. Gray-haired, orderly, his face both weary and curious. On the table before him lay a folder of documents, many stamped and resealed. "You provided goods to households under inquiry," he said matter-of-factly. She nodded once. "We ask only about transactions, not loyalties. Did you ever notice exchanges or messages hidden in merchandise?" The question, spoken so evenly, disarmed her more than accusation would have. She measured her breath before replying. "I noticed little beyond fabric and coin," she said honestly enough. It was true that she had not understood the full pattern of intrigue, only fragments. "Merchants talk. London thrives on gossip. I listen no closer than my trade requires." Her tone carried the soft fatigue of one too accustomed to discretion to break it now. The magistrate studied her hands, the faint scars from needles and scissors. Then, to her quiet relief, he sighed as though recognizing futility. "Craftspeople often see more than they say," he murmured, closing the folder. "Perhaps that is why the world continues to function." He dismissed her with a polite nod. No condemnation followed, no arresting gesture, only a mild curiosity, as if she were a single unimportant thread in a vast tangled cloth. Outside, the sun glared against the paving stones, so bright that for a moment she felt dizzy. The noise of carriages and vendors returned like a long-withheld breath. Freedom, when it comes unexpectedly, seldom feels like triumph. It feels instead like exhaustion loosening its grip. She crossed the bridge toward home, wind tugging her shawl. The river beneath her flecked with light the color of pewter and forgiveness. Back at the shop, her apprentices greeted her cheerfully, unaware that the rhythm of her heart had changed tempo. She smiled, said nothing, and resumed work. Each measured cut of the scissors restored something ordinary. By evening, she found herself humming, a tune her mother once sang while ironing linen. The melody carried no happiness, only continuity. That, she realized, was enough. Weeks passed. Amos returned briefly, his inked fingers still marked by his trade, though his manner bore new steadiness. He spoke of printing a small pamphlet advocating workers' cooperatives, safer ventures than politics. She listened, as she always did, but there was difference in her quiet now. Not just caution, but experience that weighed what truth costs. Before leaving, he set a folded proof on the counter. "Read when you've time," he said. "You've earned your peace, but perhaps don't waste it." That night she opened the sheet and read by lamplight. The words spoke of fairness, labor, and dignity. Nothing subversive, merely hopeful. Yet the ink's scents brought back the whole chain of memory, the hidden scrap, the men's voices behind the veil, even Lady Armitage's perfume mingled with deceit. Lives had collided across lines none of them fully saw. She wondered if the truth of history was simply a fabric stitched from such collisions, ordinary people brushing against events larger than understanding. In late summer, news spread quietly that the inquiries into foreign correspondence had closed. Those once whispered about returned to society, wearing civility like new varnish. The city moved on, indifferent in its vastness. Rented rooms filled again with laughter, lovers quarreled on doorsteps, market women shouted over the price of apples. Yet she sensed how London forgets by design. It must, or it would collapse under the weight of remembrance. Around this time, she took on a new apprentice, a girl with brisk fingers and a hunger for learning. Watching her struggle with the first delicate cut of ribbon, the milliner remembered her own trembling years before. Patience, she thought, may be the only inheritance worth passing down. When the girl looked up, seeking approval, she offered a small nod. Respect, quiet but sincere. The season ripened toward autumn. The shop prospered modestly, the ledger even. The walls hung with shades of silk that caught afternoon light. Yet within her lingered a changed vision of the world, a sharper sympathy, a tenderness edged with caution. She no longer believed goodness came naturally to people, only that kindness survived where pride failed. One cool evening she walked to the river, drawn by habit more than purpose. The water, murky yet shimmering under lamplight, mirrored the city's contradictions, ugliness glowing faintly with grace. A discarded newspaper fluttered against the stones, its print half washed away. She thought of Amos, somewhere setting type in a smaller town, of Lady Armitage, hidden perhaps among relatives, of a magistrate still sorting through papers that could never tell the whole truth. Lives continued, rearranged like patterns cut anew from old cloth. A gust of wind lifted her hat slightly, and she pressed it down with an unthinking smile. The gesture felt familiar, grounding. Whatever mystery she had stumbled into months ago had dissolved into memory, leaving only its lesson. That secrecy binds more tightly than thread, yet honesty without mercy can unravel even the dearest work. Most people, she decided, must learn to live somewhere between, not saint nor conspirator, but ordinary being, mending what the world tears, and hoping no one looks too closely at the seams. When she returned home, she trimmed a final bonnet before bed, pale blue with modest decoration, the kind favored by teachers and young wives. The candlelight glowed through the thin silk, casting soft halos on the walls. It was a peaceful sight, unremarkable yet steady, like life when it ceases demanding meaning and settles into quiet continuation. Outside, the city murmured through the open window, restless yet alive. She breathed it in, the air of labor and endurance, the scent of ink and wet stone. The worst of fear had passed. Even memory, like old smoke, was fading. As she extinguished the flame and prepared for sleep, the faint shimmer of the half-finished hat on her table remained, a small proof that beauty could persist, even after the secrets that threatened to destroy it had finally unraveled. Evening thickened early that autumn, settling over London like a slow exhalation. The milliner's lamp glowed from the small shop window, its light softened by gauze curtains. The same streets still murmured with carts and bootsteps, but they no longer unsettled her as they once had. Time had smoothed her apprehension into understanding, the kind earned only after too much listening, too much caution. Life, at last, had balanced itself between effort and peace. The shop bore the mark of many quiet years of labor. Shelves bowed slightly with boxes, each carefully labeled, feathers, ribbons, trims of past seasons that never lost their usefulness. The air smelled faintly of lavender and glue. Every object carried memory. A spool from Mrs. Pratt's workroom, an old ledger now filled only with prices and measurements, none containing secrets. She sometimes ran her fingers along the spines of those steady records, comforted by their harmlessness. Her apprentices had long gone, each taking with them a piece of her craft, scattering it like pollen through other quarters of the city. Now one remained, a young woman barely past girlhood, full of wakeful energy and questions. The milliner found both joy and gentle weariness in mentoring her. Watching the girl's clumsy first stitches reminded her of her own unsure beginning, when the world had still seemed ruled by mystery and possibility, rather than fear and prudence. Some evenings after closing, she would sit with the apprentice by the narrow stove, letting the last pot of tea stretch through scattered conversation. Prices at market, the rumor of a new bridge over the river, the habit of customers who never decided what they wanted until twilight. The talk wandered easily. Sometimes the girl, unaware of her teacher's history, asked whether the city had always been so restless. "Always," the milliner replied, smiling faintly. "But you grow to match its pace, the way fabric takes the shape of a steady hand." There were mornings of stillness, too. She would step outside before opening, sweeping the pavement free of last night's straw and dust, watching shopkeepers unbolt doors around her. The city's awakening held a rhythm she had learned to love. The clatter of shutters, church bells echoing faintly through the haze, voices calling bread prices into the mist. Once, such sounds had only reminded her of the struggle to persist. Now they carried a note of belonging. Even hardship, she understood, could become music once it ceased surprising you. Occasionally, a client from former years reappeared, hair now silvered, manners softened by time. They spoke of family marriages, distant travels, the price of imported dyes. No one mentioned the past that both shared but never confessed. Memory here was courteous. It bowed, exchanged news, asked about health, and moved on. She accepted that civility, grateful that forgiveness need not always require words. Amos's newspaper reached her now and then, sold by ragged boys at street corners. His name appeared modestly among the printers, the pamphlets earnest but unprovocative, essays on common virtues and small reforms. She sometimes bought a copy, not from obligation, but fondness for the scent of new ink. His sentences spoke quietly of conscience tempered by tenderness. She wondered if he ever thought of her while setting type, the patient rhythm of press to page echoing their shared hours of silence. The years had given her something rarer than comfort: perspective. She no longer sought excitement from discovery, nor safety in ignorance. Knowledge, she had come to believe, mattered less than what one chose to hold of it. Secrets could consume or illuminate, depending on how they were kept. Hers, now long closed by circumstance, had faded into faint outlines, like a pattern beneath fresh fabric, visible only when light fell from the right angle. On certain nights, she would climb the narrow stairs to her small room above the shop. There, the sounds of London softened to a steady hum. She would open the shutter slightly, watching smoke twist silver above the rooftops. The sight steadied her more than prayer. The city itself seemed both indifferent and merciful, vast enough to forget the mistakes of its dwellers, yet intimate enough to cradle those who persisted. She had grown used to a measured solitude. Some might have called it loneliness, but it had the texture of calm. Days filled with purpose, evenings with quiet thought. She kept a tin box for letters, a few from old customers, one unsigned note from Amos thanking her for long ago patience, a fragment of cloth she had once dyed violet by mistake. These small relics formed the museum of a life unnoticed, yet fully lived. Her hands still worked with precision, though slower now. Each stitch carried decades of memory, those first lessons in Mrs. Pratt's dim workroom, the thrill of owning a window of her own, the fear of losing it during those shadowed years. The weight of all that living had refined her humor into gentleness. When the apprentice cursed a broken needle, the milliner laughed softly.
"Better the needle snap than the spirit, my dear," she said. "Steel can be replaced."
Winter returned one evening with an early frost. She licked the stove and trimmed the wick of the oil lamp until it glowed steady and warm. The young apprentice sat at the table stringing beads onto satin, her face lit softly by the flame. The older woman watched for a while before speaking. "When you make something for another person," she began, not in instruction but reflection, "you lend them a fragment of your own thought. That's why the work matters, not the ribbon or the price, but the steadiness in the giving." The girl nodded without answering, absorbed in her task. The milliner smiled inwardly. Some lessons needed years of living before they ripened into understanding. She herself had learned them through mistakes, through misplaced trust, quiet defiance, and the comfort of endurance. None of it was wasted, not even the fear. Outside, snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, softening the usual disorder of the street. The world beyond her shop turned gentle, almost dreamlike. She set down her shears and gazed at the lamplight shifting on the frosted glass. In that glow, she felt the rare stillness that follows years of noise, the hush that comes not from absence but from acceptance. When the clock struck 9, she closed the shutters and banked the fire. The apprentice departed with a muffled good night, leaving behind the faint echo of laughter on the stairs. The milliner tidied the table, stacked her boxes, and at last extinguished the lamp. But long after the room fell into shadow, a single line of light leaked from beneath the door, the coal's dull heart still pulsing red. She paused on the threshold, listening to the whisper of winter wind along the roofs. The world outside was wide, full of movement she no longer needed to chase. Tomorrow would be filled with work and small wonders alike, the quiet barter of human stories beneath the brim of ordinary life. That knowledge felt enough. Before going upstairs, she touched the old sign by the door where faint letters spelled her name. The paint had faded, but it persisted, like her own heart, still beating steadily beneath years of change. She whispered nothing grand, only a promise to keep minding her craft, her peace, and the fragile kindness of each passing day. And as she climbed into the stillness above the sleeping shop, the city breathed softly through its endless chimneys, and the faint snow kept falling, layer upon layer, like fabric drawn across the worn shoulders of the world, tender, imperfect, and quietly warm.